I saw and held in my hand evidence that the government of the United States was violating the rights of its people. I talked to my coworkers about this. They nodded their head. They thought, yeah, okay, but what are you going to do about it, right? And we all agreed, they were the ones who pointed it out, that if you say something about this, you're really going to pay for it. Boy, did they call that one. But the idea is, if all of us do what we can, it will be enough. And this is the critical thing that we have to know. We may not be able to save the world in one stroke. Nobody can, nobody will, but you don't have to. Recognize that enough is enough. There's an old saying that goes, the man who knows enough is enough will always have enough. We have to start somewhere. We're in a bad place right now. We must not remain there.
Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming out. I was in Auschwitz today. It was my first time there. I stood on the ground where my grandmother and grandfather and my aunt landed in June of 1944 when I was 5 months of age. And except for some circumstances, it could very easily have happened that my mother and I would have ended up in the same spot. And I know the Nazi doctors, you go to the right, you get to be a worker. You go to the left, you go to the gas chambers. And my mother with a small baby, that's where we would have gone. And that's where my grandparents went. And when I first found out about that horror, I was 11 or 12 years old. And for years, actually, every time I thought about it, I thought my head would actually, it's almost like I was dizzy. My head would spin, and I thought, how could this even have happened? How is this even possible? And how could the world let it happen? Well, my head is not spinning anymore, but the world is letting it happen again. It's in a different form. It's a different set of circumstances. But the essence of it is the same. Children are being murdered in their beds. People are being tortured. They're being starved. The whole land has been demolished. The animals have been killed. The plants have been destroyed. Everything has been obliterated, and the world watches. In this country, on Saturday, I finish here on Friday, and then on Saturday I fly to Hungary. And this country, and my country, Hungary, are welcoming a war criminal here and into Hungary as if nothing had happened. A war criminal who has been charged with war crimes by the International Court of Justice. A war criminal in a country where there are 4 internationally known, renowned experts on genocide, Jews, who have called what's happening right now genocide. They're saying that what Israel is doing right now meets the international legal definition of genocide. You don't need to have gas chambers. You don't have to have Nazi doctors. You just have to have people in power who want to control and if necessary, obliterate another people. And that's what we're seeing right now. Do you know how Israel wages war? There was an article today in the Haaretz newspaper, which is one of the maybe one or two publications in Israel that tells the truth sometimes. You know how they wage war? There are Palestinian children with diabetes. As you know, diabetes is a disease in which the blood sugar level rises because the diabetic lacks a substance called insulin, and you need insulin for the sugar to enter the cells. And without insulin, the blood is full of sugar and the person dies. So they need insulin injections. But Israel does not let in the equipment for Palestinian parents to measure their children's sugar levels. So the parents have to guess what the sugar level of the kid is and guess how much insulin to give. And if you give too much insulin, the child can die. And if you give too little, they get sick. This is how Israel wages war. Never mind the bombs. Bad enough. Can you imagine? No, at Auschwitz, what you saw was the clever cruelty of the bureaucratic mind. A mind that can plan such horrors. Well, Israel has been doing that for decades in Gaza. How much calories can the Palestinians survive on? Not letting in medicines, medical equipment is not a new thing. It's been going for a long time. The first massacre of people in Gaza did not happen in 2000 and, Israel's had these bombing campaigns in Gaza for a long time. This is not the first time that they've killed hundreds of civilians, this time thousands, hundreds of children. That's been going on repeatedly for a long time. But the first massacre in Gaza took place in a place called Kfar Qasim in 1956, where they literally massacred hundreds of civilians. They lined them up and they shot them. The bodies, it was in the heat of the summer, and people were under curfew, so the bodies rotted in the streets for days before they could be buried. This is how Israel wages war. And it's a trick of the colonial mind that the aggressor is always the victim who fights back. In Hungary, where the German army invaded in 1944, after they'd finished with the Jewish population elsewhere in Eastern Europe, then it was Hungary's turn. There was a headline in a fascist newspaper. What happened was that some Jewish youth apparently shot at some German soldiers. But this is after millions of Jews had been killed. Millions. So these Hungarian Jewish resistors shot at some German soldiers. You know what the headline in this fascist newspaper was in Hungary? Jews shoot at German soldiers. So far, their punishment has been mild. So far their punishment has been mild, after millions have been murdered. But that's the colonial, domineering, militaristic, aggressor mentality, that is always the victim who fights back, who's actually the aggressor. Now, in 1956, before Kfar Qasim, there was some Palestinians who infiltrated into Israel and from Gaza, and they killed an Israeli. Well, of course, the Israelis were outraged. How can they do this? Moshe Dayan was the chief of the Israeli army then, and he gave a speech, a very interesting speech, in 1956. You know what he said? Let us not cast blame on the murderers today. Why should we deplore their burning hatred for us? For 8 years, this is 56, he's talking about 1948. For 8 years, they've been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes, we have been transforming the lands and villages where they and their fathers lived into our own estate. He admitted it. Why should they not hate us? We took their land. And across the barbed wire, they're watching us create wealth and build homes on their lands. But he didn't say that in order to create empathy for the Palestinians. He didn't say, yeah, we did this, let's make peace with them. No, his intention was totally different. He says, we are a generation of settlers. No, we are a generation that settles the land, and without the steel helmet and the cannon, we will not be able to plant a tree or build a home. Let's not fear to look squarely at the hatred that consumes and fills the lives of hundreds of Arabs who live around us. This is the fate of our generation. This is our choice, to be ready and armed, tough and hard, or else the sword shall fall from our hands and our lives will be cut short. At least he was honest. At least he was telling his people, let's understand what we're dealing with here. What we're dealing with here is a people from whom we've taken the land. And of course they hate us. Of course they want the land back. So we have to be really tough and make sure that that doesn't happen. What's happened since then, even that aggressive honesty has disappeared. Now we have the utter hypocrisy of the Israeli government well, let me find you a quote, if I could, from my cell phone. Give me a moment here. Let's see, Netanyahu, what did he say? Just take me a moment. Oh yeah, here it is. You know what this is Benjamin Netanyahu last July. And he said, this is a conflict between barbarism and civilization, and a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. Have you ever heard a more nauseatingly hypocritical and dishonest statement in history? I mean, there have been many nauseating, disgusting, hypocritical statements in history. Have you ever heard one like that? That this is a struggle between those who glorify death and those who value life, and those who value life are murdering tens of thousands of people in the name of civilization? Now There's a wonderful Egyptian Canadian writer called Omar El-Akkad, and I'm going to read you something that he said. Sorry. Well, I don't know why I can't find it right now. I don't want to take your time. Look, oh, here it is. I found it. He said, to preserve the values of the civilized world, it is necessary to set fire to a library, to blow up a mosque, to incinerate olive trees, to dress up in the lingerie of women who fled and then put that on TikTok, which they did. Israeli soldiers, they loot these homes where the Palestinians fled, they put on these women clothes and they start dancing, and they put that on TikTok. He said, to preserve the values of civilized society, we have to level universities, to loot jewelry, art, banks, food, to arrest children for picking vegetables, to shoot children for throwing stones, to parade the captured in their underwear, to break a man's teeth and shove a toilet brush down his mouth, to let combat dogs loose on a man with Down syndrome and then leave him to die. This young man with Down syndrome, totally harmless. They attacked him with their army dogs and let him to die. Otherwise, he says, the uncivilized world might win. And so, what's this all about? Well, you can say that it's in part about Jewish trauma. In part it is. I mean, you can't go to Auschwitz and not understand the deep anguish and fear and determination that this will never happen again to us. You can understand it. But that doesn't explain what's going on. That does not explain what's going on. Because you can have that determination to survive without oppressing and murdering another people. What we're talking about here, on the emotional side, of course, there is the memory of Auschwitz, there's that terrible memory of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, of course, including here in Poland. David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, his name was David Gruen, he came from Poland. Polish history is interesting that way. Well, every nation's history is interesting. But Poland, as you know, is a country where freedom from foreign occupation has been the theme of your history. Going back to the partition of Poland back in the 18th century between three great powers, and then 1831, the great Polish uprising against not the only uprising, but that was the great one in 1831 against Russian rule. In fact, I mention every talk I give here that when I grew up in Hungary, I had two Polish heroes. Because in 1848, the Hungarians rose up against the Austrian rule, and they fought a very promising war of liberation until the Tsar sent in the Russian troops to help the Austrian emperor defeat the Hungarians. But two of the leading generals in the Hungarian army were Poles, Joseph Bem and Henryk Dębinski. So these are names that I grew up with. And in 1956, when there were workers' demonstrations in Poznan in October, in Hungary, there were demonstrations that began in sympathy with the Polish workers. And the students and the workers in Budapest gathered at the statue of General Joseph Bem, the Polish general. And that's how the Hungarian Revolution began in 1956. So what I'm saying is that independence from foreign occupation, liberty, freedom, has been a deep motive theme in Polish history. But as in every people's history, there's contradictions. And the Poles who fought for their own liberation, to the Ukrainians at some point, the Polish nobility were the oppressors. I'm not saying this to blame anybody, I'm just telling you the complexity of history. And one of the complexities, of course, there was deep anti-Semitism here in Poland. And during the war, some Poles jeopardized their lives to save Jewish lives. We know that. And I know people who wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for that support of the Polish population. And there were other Poles who denounced Jews, or who bribed them, or who tried to blackmail them so as not to turn them in. So, amongst every people there's always all kinds of contradictions and different levels of morality, of lack of morality. But what I'm saying is that if any people should be able to understand the struggle of the Palestinians against foreign occupation, the Polish people should be able to understand it. Because that's what happened. So there's certainly this fuel of historical Jewish trauma that goes on to express itself in the Zionist movement. And in my teens and up to I was 20 years old, so I was a very fervent Zionist. I really believed in the dream. I knew nothing about Palestinians, of course. I just knew Jewish history from a Zionist point of view. And so I really believed in that dream. And then at some point I found out, there's another side. And the Zionist dream, or the Zionist myth, that there's a land without a people for a people without a land. That was the slogan. A land without a people for a people without a land. And that was supposed to be Palestine. Well, of course, that was a lie. There was no land without a people. There were people living there, tilling the soil, planting olive trees for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, a very interesting argument can be made and has been made that the ancient Jews, they didn't leave Palestine, all of them. Many of them stayed there as working peasants until Islam came in and they converted to Islam. Some of the Palestinian village names resemble Hebraic or Aramaic place names. And so that the Palestinians, literally, some of them, are probably descendants of ancient Jews. By the way, this isn't my theory, this has been put forward. Even Ben Gurion believed that. He wrote a book about it. But here's the deal. I could get on an airplane tomorrow, land in Tel Aviv at Ben Gurion Airport, which is located at the site of a Palestinian city that was wiped out in 1948, and the people were killed and forced to flee, and many of them died as they were fleeing. So I could land at that airport tomorrow. Tomorrow is what? Is it Thursday tomorrow? By Friday, I could be a citizen under the right of return. The right of return says that any Jew, that Israel, you see, Israel is not, they say it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It's not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy. The Israeli law says that this is the land of the Jews, not of its citizens, but of the Jews. That means if I land there tomorrow, by the day after tomorrow, I have more rights than the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Under the right of return, you, if you're not Jewish, you could convert to Judaism. You could go through the process of conversion, which takes, depending on which tradition you convert in, but could take you a couple of years and become a religious Jew. And then you could go back to Israel under the right of return. The right of return. Meanwhile, in a little while, you will hear from a man, a John, from Gaza, who's got no right to return, even though he was born there. Can you imagine that? The so-called right of return? And worse, if I move to the occupied territories, by the way, that's a word that's increasingly forbidden even to use in Israel. Occupied, it's not occupied, it's our land. Why? Because God gave it to us thousands of years ago. But I could move to the occupied territories, and I visited there twice. First in 1991, and then second time 3 years ago. And if I moved to the occupied territories, I could move into a settlement where I'd be given a subsidized house in a settlement with green trees and grass and vegetation and a swimming pool. Meanwhile, the Palestinian living 2 miles away down the valley has no right to dig a well in his own land. He's got no right to dig a well without permission. And if he digs a well to feed his animals and his family, they'll come and fill up the well with stones, or he might be arrested. See, I could talk to you about the massacre, but I don't have to, because if you hear, you know about the massacre that's going on right now in Gaza. But the details you don't hear about, in a certain sense, are even more infuriating. I recently wrote a foreword to a book by a Palestinian psychiatrist, Dr. Sama Jabbar. She was the head of psychiatry for Palestine. And in her book, she says, well, what am I supposed to do, she says, with an 81-year-old man who's so depressed he wants to kill himself because the home that he built with his own hands 30 years ago, now he's being forced to destroy it with his own hands because he didn't have permission to build on his own land. Am I supposed to give him Prozac, a medicine for his depression? And when I was there 3 years ago, working with Palestinian women with post-traumatic stress disorder, excuse me, because they've been tortured in Israeli jails, I was told there's no post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. It's ongoing every day. So let me tell you a little story. This is reported in the New York Times, which lies every day, and it doesn't tell the truth, hides the truth every day. Every once in a while, the truth breaks through by some accident. So in this story, here's how it goes. Settlers, this is in the West Bank, where, by the way, we don't even talk about this, but since October the 7th, in the West Bank, 900 Palestinians have been killed, including old women and babies. Tens of thousands of people have been kicked out of their home in the West Bank. So, and the settlers come and attack, and they conduct pogroms against the Palestinians. They beat them up, they damage their homes, sometimes they kill them, they threaten them, they burn down their olive trees. Why did they burn the olive trees? Because the Palestinians love their olive trees. They just love their olive trees. It's their life, and it's their history, it's their tradition. So there's no better way to humiliate and oppress them than to destroy their trees. And then, in Canada, maybe here too, they collect money to plant trees in Israel. Plant trees in Israel at the site of villages that have been destroyed. So anyway, in this particular story, this family, and Palestinians live in large families. Settlers come and they damage the home. And the Palestinians had to flee just to escape the violence. But once the settlers are finished, a few days later, the Palestinians come back. And their home has been damaged. There's a hole in the roof. This is December. It's cold rain. And there's a hole in the roof. And a representative of the Israeli occupation comes to the Palestinians and says, "Oh, you can come back, but you can't repair your home, because that would be construction without a license. In fact, you can't even put a plastic cover over your roof, because that would be construction without a license, and that means we can come and destroy your home because you're constructed without a license." What bureaucratic, cruel mind can come up with something like that? And how is it that your press doesn't tell you these stories every day? Because they happen every day. Every day they happen. We talk about the Israeli hostages. And you know what? I think it was a crime to capture civilians and children and old people. They had every right to capture soldiers. That's a war. Those are prisoners of war. But I'm talking about the civilians. So we talk a lot about these Israeli hostages. What about the tens of thousands of Palestinian hostages that have been in Israeli jails for a long time? 3 weeks ago, they let out a 23-year-old after 10 years in prison. He was 13 years old, accused of terrorism. He didn't even have a weapon. And for 10 years, he was mistreated and tortured. Now he's an emotional wreck. And when they released him, they wouldn't even release him to his family. They released him in some field miles away. You know what and tens of thousands of Palestinians have been through the jails. Right now, there's probably 11,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. You know what they're accused of? Writing graffiti against the occupation. Putting a notice on social media against the occupation. Like they don't have the right to oppose the occupation and expropriation of their own land. And they can be put into jail for years without even a trial. It's not that Israel even has the right to try them, it doesn't. But if there's a trial, you know what it looks like? The prosecution says, this person is accused of terrorism or support of terrorism. The judge says, where's the evidence? The prosecutor says, that's a state security secret. The judge says, guilty. That's what a Palestinian trial looks like in the only democracy in the Middle East. Now, let me come to a conclusion here. And I could tell you much more. I'll only tell you personally that I've never seen anything like it. I mean, as an adult or as a conscious human being, I've never seen anything like this. And I've seen a lot of things. But my heart just breaks every day, and I'm enraged every day. And as enraged as I am by the perverse cruelty and violence of the Israeli state, I'm at least equally enraged by the silence and complicity of the civilized world, of the democratic world. So what's that about? Why is the Polish government making it okay for Netanyahu to visit here, this war criminal? Why are the Germans and the French and the British and the Americans sending weapons? Against whom? Against whom? A civilian population. And a few fighters with guns. And they send airplanes and 2,000 bombs and white phosphorus chemicals and ammunition, intelligence equipment, everything. Now, why is that? Excuse me. Because every one of those countries, not Poland in this case, but the West, Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, England, United States, have been colonial countries. Their wealth is based on the expropriation of the wealth of the rest of the world. Sheer robbery. Empire is robbery. The Roman Empire was robbery. The British Empire was robbery. The British Museum is the world's largest collection of stolen goods, stolen art. And every one of those countries had committed genocide. The Americans did it against the indigenous people. As a matter of fact, Hitler learned from the Americans about the extermination of the indigenous people. It was one of his inspirations was America. The Spanish, of course, the Portuguese, the Belgians. I'm going to ask you just raise your hand if you know this fact, that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, about 120, 130 years ago, the Belgians caused the death of 12 million people in the Congo. Raise your hand if they told you that in school. If they told you that in school. Very few hands. How come they didn't tell you that? How come they didn't tell you that? How come they didn't tell you about all the other genocides? How come they didn't tell you that the first German genocide wasn't against Jews, it was against black Africans? in what is known as Namibia. They don't tell you that because the West is a colonial entity. And how does and Israel is part of that colonial enterprise. So much of what drives what we're seeing right now is not just the result of Jewish trauma. What we're actually seeing right now is the last major expression of Western colonialism, where the indigenous people are inhuman, they don't matter. How dare they fight back? And even if they fight back peacefully, we kill them. Israel is always saying, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Peaceful resistance. You know where he is? He's dead. In 2019, 2020, in Gaza, the Gazans had what they called the Great March of Return, where they unarmed marched up to the barbed wire. And I saw the barbed wire in Auschwitz. Gaza is surrounded by the same barbed wire. And Gaza has been called by an Israeli sociologist the world's largest concentration camp. So they marched up to the barbed wire demanding to return to those homes that Moshe Dayan was talking about. The Israelis killed hundreds of them. They were totally unarmed. Even if they were wearing medical uniforms, if they were in wheelchairs, they shot them. And you can read this in the Israeli press. The snipers in their tanks or on their sandbanks, as they were looking down at these civilians, unarmed people, they had a contest. Who could shatter more Palestinian knees? This was their fun and games. Nobody in the West reported this. It wasn't news. Where does Eastern Europe come into this? Well, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Czechia, Slovakia, all these countries have decided that we have to belong to the West. That means we have to swallow, absorb, and express Western ideology. And so basically, you've been brainwashed. I don't mean you personally. I mean you as a country. That in order to belong to the West, you have to take on Western values, and Western values is the values of colonialism. And that's why they don't tell you the truth. That's why they allowed this mass murderer to visit here. And that's why you never hear Palestinian voices. So tonight it's going to be an exception. There's a man here from Gaza, Ajan, who's going to follow me right now on stage. And he is a Polish citizen, but he's from Gaza. And you're going to hear a story that usually you don't hear. So if you would come up now. Where are you guys? We're coming, okay. And thanks. And after he speaks and tells his story, then we'll take questions from the audience. And I'd be happy to do that. I just say one last thing to you. The biggest weapon, the biggest ideological weapon that they use, you see, what am I? I'm a self-hating Jew. Why else would I speak on behalf of the Palestinians? I must hate myself. If you're not Jewish, you're not a self-hating Jew, you're an anti-Semite. So anybody who speaks in favor of Palestinian freedom, anybody who tells the truth, you must either be a self-hating Jew or Israeli, or if you're not Jewish, you must be an anti-Semite. And of course, given the terrible history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and given the Holocaust, and given the very sad history of anti-Semitism here in Poland, nobody wants to be identified as an anti-Semite. Nobody wants to be associated with the most brutal ideology, bias in history. Don't let them intimidate you. It's intellectual, emotional terrorism. You can support Jewish dignity and you can acknowledge Jews' suffering without denying Palestinian history. And you can speak up, and I hope you do. Because you see, there was a man called Aaron Bushnell. Aaron Bushnell was an American soldier, a veteran, who, in the beginning of this genocide, he sat down in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington and he burnt himself to death. He immolated himself. And he wrote a note and he said, when your grandchildren ask you what you were doing during the genocide, this is what you're doing right now. So when your grandchildren ask you, what did you do during the genocide? I hope you have a good answer. And I hope that answer won't be, I was too afraid to speak up because I didn't want to be an anti-Semite, I didn't want to offend anybody. So I know that the people who came out here are the people who care, to whom justice matters, who don't want human suffering, who don't want Jewish suffering, who don't want Palestinian suffering, who don't want Ukrainian suffering, any kind of suffering. I just hope that you find a way, each in your own way, to do what you can, because there's a slogan about never again, you know. Well, it's at least let it not be said that in this terrible time we were silent. Thank you for listening. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ala Kandil. I'm a Polish-Palestinian reporter. I'm also a co-founder of Cactus Initiative. The reason I'm here is because in 2014, I worked in the Gaza Strip. I was covering Israeli atrocities against Gazan civilians, and I was documenting them. And after that, I returned many times to Gaza to collect stories of those killed and the survivors, together with a colleague, Unpack, which we then collected in a Obliterated Families webdoc. Before we start, and we start listening to Amjad's story, I want to explain in just a few words why we're here. And one of it, big part of it, is what you wrote, Dr. Mate, in your book, that trauma happens when we are not noticed and not understood. That's a quote from another writer, of course. And we would like to prevent it as much as possible today. I want to say also one more thing, that, you know, I grew up in Poland, but I also spent a lot of time in Palestine. And I see one major similarity between Polish and Israeli society. And that's a refusal to acknowledge that you can be both a victim and a perpetrator. What you mentioned, the Polish people who were complicit in extermination of Jews in Poland, this is well documented. But it's still so controversial to say it. And that's about being able to hold oneself accountable, of course, and to recognize the history. And that's exactly the same mechanism with the Israeli society. But it's a little bit different with the Palestinians, because while Poles and Israelis are fighting for who's the biggest victim here, Palestinians are actually really frustrated with this position we're stuck in. So on one hand, we're here because we want that the Palestinian suffering, the Palestinian experience is heard, is understood, is recognized, it's acknowledged. But at the same time, Palestinians keep getting pushed into this very narrow role, this very narrow definition. This is what Mohammed El-Kurd wrote about in Perfect Victim. Palestinians are the stories that we're allowed to tell, that are heard, are only those where Palestinians are passive, are victims, are pitiable. And one example is a complaint brought by 3 Polish Palestinians against Israeli officials for the war crimes committed against them and their families in Gaza. The same media that were so much asking for your presence would not be interested at all in hearing that story, because it's about Palestinian agency. And we see that it's something that makes people really uncomfortable, because when we assume any agency, when we show anger, when we show different emotions, people don't get to be our saviors. So, as you mentioned also in your book, not speaking about trauma does not mean it will go away or disappear. It will be just rooted even deeper. And my worry is that this is what so many Palestinians do. To avoid being pushed into this role of a victim, they hide their pain, they hide their trauma, they hide all the emotions, which I also know from my own family, of course. But today we want to break this cycle. And this is why we're asking you, Dr. Mate, and we ask the audience to be the empathetic witnesses and to really listen and to hear Amjad's story of his life and his family's life in Gaza before October 23, of surviving the genocide, evacuating his family to Poland and trying to heal and grieve at the same time and rebuild his life here in Poland. So, as I will have the honor of assisting Amjad in telling his story, I will switch now to Polish. Pozwolę sobie Państwu powiedzieć.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just say a few words about Amjad before we continue with his story. Amjad, as you know, was born in Palestine, in Gaza, southern part in Han Yunis. In 70s, when he was just a child, Gaza, and it's hard to believe, was a very green agricultural place with around the house in which he was growing up. There was an olive tree, of course. His family had citrus fruits that were exported to the whole Europe through Jordan, and a lot of time he spent by the sea. In 80s in Gaza brought many changes because Israel started to construct Jewish places, started to destroy agriculture because it was too competitive for the Israeli farmers. After he graduated from high school, he wanted to continue his education, and you came to Poland to study, and major part of diaspora in Poland has a very similar story. Also my dad. It was a breaking point of 80s and 90s, and you were telling me that Poland, despite having closed borders, was very open, and people that were meeting you were nice, were asking about the Holy Ground, Palestine as well, and it reminds me of Gaza, with strict blockade for more than 20 years right now. Every time that I had the pleasure to visit Gaza, I couldn't wonder enough about the hospitality of the citizens. In 2025 you returned to Gaza because of your elder parents, but thanks to the education you started to work at the Ministry of Agriculture and with Department of Mushrooms actually. And after you returned, Hamas won the election, and as you probably know, Israel started a very strict blockade on this Palestine area. So import-export economy was squished, traffic limited as well, and Israel cut off the energy supply as well. Right now it had 8 hours of power being on and 8 hours the power being off, and that's for the good part of Gaza. So I just wanted to ask you about your job at the laboratory and how was it affected by this blockade. So this work was conducted in a very traditional way. It means that there was no possibility to import mushrooms for other countries. So in this laboratory, it was possible for us to grow our own mushrooms. And because of the material situation in Gaza, we had this idea that we were introducing to people and to organizations how to grow this mycelium and those mushrooms, and that some profit can be made out of this. And it is known that the mushrooms that we were growing have plenty of protein, and it was like a substitute for red meat. Plus oyster mushrooms, because we are talking about oyster mushrooms, are doing well in high temperatures. So despite having no expert equipment, it was still possible for you to grow them. And you met Ala at your job, your future wife, right? That's true. And after 2020, we got married, and we have 2 small children, Malik, 4 years old, and Teresa, 3 years old. You started to live in the heart of Han Yunis in a 1-story building. You were at the ground floor and your brother on the first floor, and what was surrounding the building. There were our cousins living nearby and friends, and this is very characteristic for the Gaza. Those communities that are being created very frequently in a single building. The families live together. How did your life look like before 7th October? I usually woke up to pray. I drank my coffee, I was reading messages, and I just went to a neighboring city to work. Then after return we had a dinner together after that, and it was a playtime for me and the kids, and in the evening there was the last time to pray, and it was possible to go to a shop, to a restaurant, and to purchase something like falafel, to some bakeries to get some warm bread as well. And you can add something to that as well, some knafa, so a dough characteristic for Palestine, for Gaza. On Saturday, however, the only day off, you were either going to the sea or you were going shopping. Han Yunis Bazaar, but on the 7th of October you managed to go out to pray, to return, but you didn't go anywhere, right? Unfortunately, around 7 a.m. we woke up to the sounds of bombs dropping. We didn't know where it comes from, we didn't know who did that, but after a couple of hours we knew that this is an attack of the occupied zone. Unfortunately, later on there was no possibility to leave the house because there were still attacks, aircraft attacks. It was just scary to go out. You not only didn't leave your houses, but Allah decided that you will actually move your bedroom to the corridor because it's the most central part of the house and the most secure, and that was actually the thing that saved your life. Could you tell us what happened a week later, on 14th of October, Saturday as well? So that was the day that the war started. I also started with a prayer in the morning when I returned, and because I'm not going to work on that day, I didn't make myself coffee. I was only listening to the news about the bombing. Around 7 a.m. there was a huge noise that woke us up. And at that time we didn't know what happened exactly. It was dark, it was very hot, and there was a lot of dust in the air, and my wife was screaming all the time. She was calling my name, she was asking, "Where are you? Where are the kids?" And I was asleep on the corner as the first one, and Malik was next to me. And I stood up, and I picked him up because he was crying all the time. And my wife was screaming in the meantime, asking about the other daughter, and she was crying very loudly at that time. But it was not possible to see where she is because the debris was still falling down, the debris of the house, the glass, the metal that was in the air. And your brother came, right? Who went downstairs from the story above you. And yes, at that moment my brother came and he started to scream, and he had a cell phone, so he was using the light, and he pointed the light at me, and I handed Malik to him. But unfortunately, Raza stopped crying at that moment. And it was the moment that we all knew that she passed away. She's not alive. She's not here anymore. It was still very hot. It was very hard to breathe. There was no oxygen. But you managed to find Razan, and your brother took her, and the ambulance took the kids to the hospital. When they took kids, It was just me and my wife, Ala. We stayed at that place. She kept saying that she cannot feel her legs. She was covered with debris up until her neck, and I tried to remove those rocks off her to free her up, and in that moment the fire started, and all the people that came to aid us, they escaped, and I was left with the decision: what should I do? Should I escape and save myself, or stay with my wife, and either we die or we'll survive together?
Mm.
And the choice for me was to stay, and I removed my jacket. I covered my face to try to get at least a couple of breaths, and I started to slowly remove the remaining glass, that metal, that concrete that collapsed on us. After some time, the fire was extinguished and people returned to us, and together we managed to save Ala and get her out of this debris. And an ambulance was waiting for you, right? And it was the same person that took your kids to the hospital, right? And he told you right away that kids are alive. And that's true, but we didn't believe, because we saw that when Razan was taken by the ambulance, she was not breathing, she was not responding in any way, and my brother told me later on that he was convinced 100% that she died, but they took us to the hospital, and at the hospital when we entered the emergency ward, we heard a loud cry of our kids, the two of them. Despite the surrounding chaos, because there were so many victims, it was something that you heard the very first moment. Yes. And we immediately felt better. Ala was feeling a bit worse, so they conducted the initial check to perform an X-ray as well. And after a couple of hours, they told us that we can go home, and a friend of our family came, and she take Malik, Razan and Ala to her home, because our house was non-existent. There was no returning. But you took a cab and you went as far as you could to your house to see what was there. You had no shoes, you had no flip-flops, because you gave those to your wife, to Ala, and it turned out that you cannot go close, because it's very possible that the pilots were using MK-84 bomb that it dropped on your cousin's house, that the kids of were playing with your kids, and radius is 300 meters. That it's a weapon that should not be used in areas that are occupied by civilians. Israel used at least 30 20,000 from August to September 2024, and that was the most favorite bomb of Israeli aircraft. No other countries using such bombs since Vietnam. You entered a cab without any shoes, destroyed roads, glass everywhere. How did you manage to get into your home? I couldn't feel anything. I didn't actually feel the glass beneath my feet. I was just unconscious to a certain degree. I returned home, and that was the moment when I learned that the house of my cousins was bombed, and our house was destroyed as well. And I stood there. I was watching those fields of destruction. I was not talking to anyone. I was not saying anything. I was just staring at it. And eventually I went to my colleague to spend the night, this one night. And a couple of days later, there was an order that Han Yunis has to be evacuated to the western part because there's another attack coming. And this is the moment when you were moved to tents in which you spent the next 5 to 6 months. There's many aspects of how your life in those tents looked like. And I wanted to ask about what you said helped you to survive. You were living in 2 tents. One was for women and kids. The second one was for men. And you lived with your families, with your relatives, family of your brother as well. Can you please tell me and tell us how this community worked? When you were removed from Al-Mawasi, you were removed together, but you were also saying a lot of work together to survive.
Definitely gathering close relatives allowed me to function somehow. And together with my family, we've been trying to get bread and water and to get food in general, because in this period there was no flour anymore. And we've been fighting to at least get some vegetables for children and sweets at least in the beginning. We couldn't find any. After a while, there were no more. But we've been always talking to the family or trying to eat together, have joint lunches, or go on a trip. Will you tell us about the famous storyteller Gabor Maté, who's been accompanying you in a tent? We had an older person who's experienced, and he's been telling us about 1947, where people were leaving and selling the fruits and vegetables, how people from Gaza took commodities like peaches or oranges to Jaffa and to other cities, Palestinian cities. He's also a friend of animals, and he's been telling about his goats and mutants. And he also had a tree called Sharon or Kaki. and that was the only tree he really liked. I hope that during the rest of the conversation we'll hear more, both from Dr. Gabor and from the audience, how important the role of the community is in survival and healing. And I also wanted to talk about one more topic. This is an even more difficult one because you and your children have experienced hunger, cold, and suffering. And in crisis, the parents lower the rations to feed the youngest, and the youngest are usually the first victims because of their fragility. Children grow and develop very fast, and they need constant supply of energy, vitamins, protein. When they lack food, it's not just that the organs and the brain develop properly, but under nourishment also weakens them, so it makes them getting sick with diarrhea or with the pneumonia, and it's hard to fight. I wanted to tell what happened to Malik and Roseanne when you've been waiting for more than 3 or 4 months for the permission to leave Gaza to Poland. What was the state the children were in? Unfortunately, the children had diarrhea and high fever all the time. We didn't have access to hospitals or to any medicine. And it was winter and you were in a tent. The first night spent in a tent was when Allah woke up completely wet. The children were sleeping on the floor on a very small mattress, and it was all wet, and we had to carry everything out to let it dry and not to rot. And we've been trying to search for a doctor, for a physician in one of the hospitals in Khan Yunis and in Vanasar, but they were not really looking closely at diseases like diarrhea or high fever, because they were people who were in much worse condition, being brought by the ambulances. And unfortunately, we were not able to stop the process up to a point where Raza had experienced very acute anemia and a state of malnourishment. The doctor have diagnosed that the Razan has suffered from malnourishment, and many people in Poland started putting pressure on the foreign ministry in Poland to get a permission for you to leave. This is a very long story, so let's leave the details for another occasion, but you finally had to face a really difficult choice once the permission was granted, but only for Allah and the children. It was not the first time where you had to decide whether you stay together or whether you part. In 2014, many families who got an evacuation order or who got a permission to leave or who stayed at home had to separate once it was clear that the Israel is systematically bombarding the families in their beds, sleeping or finishing their meals, and so one parent used to sleep in one part of the house and the other on the opposite. I noticed that during the genocide, the current genocide, most families have dropped this strategy, and I heard that if we're about to die, let's die together. So I wanted to ask a question. The decision for Allah and the children to leave was very difficult for each of you, right? So none of you wanted to part. Earlier, when she suffered from acute anemia attacks, I proposed my wife to take the children and go to the mother to another location, but she did not agree. And once we got the answer for the council, it was that she with the children can leave and I have to stay. That was sort of a funny, because I'm the Polish citizen, I have the Polish passport, and my wife has no citizenship and no passport. The children do. But this is when they decided to divide a family, and you're not the only ones who went through that. Many Palestinian Polish families who waited for a permission to leave Gaza were put in exactly the same situation. That Poland only wanted their own citizens to part, to just send the children or to be accompanied by one parent only. And this was a very cruel policy. And the only reason for that Israel was arbitrarily deciding who can leave Gaza and who cannot. Yes, unfortunately, we had a very tough decision to make. Allah leaves with the children, or they stay. We decided together that she will leave and I'll stay, and at least I'll be able to rescue my wife with children. And so I stayed in Gaza waiting for further development of events. And since we finally got in touch with Ella, and since there were attempts to pull me out of there, and the attempts were the following: we had to pay a bribe to let me out of the Gaza Strip. And thanks to people in Poland, thanks to the Cactus Association and Nomada Association, I was able to leave there. They simply paid $5,000 to a Egyptian military gang in Palestine, officially a tourist agency. This agency, called Hala, before Israel took over Rafah, was making about $2 million a day on Palestinians who wanted to rescue their lives. I'd like to ask you the last question to give a voice to the audience and to Dr. Gabor Mate. Despite it all, despite all those nightmares, you are in Poland now and safe. I know that nothing has become easy, and your relatives, your family members are dying and getting sick and being endangered. And on the other hand, you've managed to achieve something amazing. You've managed to build a community around you. I wanted to ask you, what's the role of this in the whole healing process of your family? How you find it here? Thanks to us landing up in Wrocław, we are surrounded by very warm and friendly people. We got to know them in Nomada, and they keep supporting us each and every moment. They always present, they always visit our houses, play with the children, they talk to us, and they take walks with my wife, with Malik, with Razan. They come accompanied by dogs, and so the children can play with the dog. And I, of course, cannot forget that the Cactus Initiative in Warsaw has been calling us, and I and Allah has even she done much more for us. We are grateful to her that we're in Poland, that we're safe. I'll just like to quote one thing you've said. You told me that when you're with people, with the new community here, this is the only time when you're not simultaneously in Gaza. So I want to thank you a lot for sharing your stories with everyone, and I know that each and every word carried a huge burden and pain, because you've been going back to the most difficult moments in your life. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. In Canada, there's a war going on in the Ukraine, as you know. And as terrible as that war is, and we know that civilians have died, and it's a brutal conflict. And I don't like to compare situations, but the degree of danger to civilians, proportionately the number of civilians, the number of children, the hunger, the disease, there's no comparison. Ukraine is getting all kinds of support. Poland and other countries have accepted Ukrainian refugees without asking any questions. I just want to mention that in Canada, within a few months, they processed 1 million Ukrainian visas for Ukrainians who were refugees from their conflict. In a few weeks, 1 million visas. In all these months, Canada has managed not to process even 5,000 visas from Gaza. Now think of that. And I'm just going to ask you a question, Ajahn. What's it like to be a Palestinian in this world? What's it like to be a Palestinian in this world that doesn't want to see you, your suffering, doesn't want to acknowledge it, that denies your history, and where you almost don't exist? I mean, I don't know if that question means something to you, but if you can answer it, what does it feel like?
Well, it's very sad for us to have no citizenship, no right to live, and the world is not reacting to what is happening in Gaza, what is happening with us. And for years that has been happening. There's no option of education, there's no option to leave, there's no option for regular healthcare even, because there's still this blockade at Gaza Strip. And in Europe, there's no justice, I would say. national. They don't recognize this country, this nation. So there's plenty of pain, of suffering, and this bitter taste. Because we exist, but people don't see us, or they don't want to see us.
Thank you. Okay, I think at this point we'll open up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I think someone will come to you with a mic. Is that right? Yeah, great. And you can ask the question of me or John and whatever you want. You know what? I would much rather be here talking to you about what I usually talk about. Happy topics like addiction and mental illness and children's developmental problems and stress and health and healing and trauma. All these beautiful topics. I'd much rather be here talking about that. But right now, there's no bigger trauma in the world than what we're seeing. So, questions?
Hi, right here. Hello? Up here? Yeah, so this is a bit of a multi-part question. Sorry to take some of your time. But when are we going to, in your opinion, when are we going to stop hearing stories like these? When are we going to stop seeing the stuff that we're seeing on social media, people dying, really grotesque scenes that we're seeing? How is it going to come about? And when it is done, right, how are we going to hold the people that are responsible for this genocide accountable? Where you drew a lot of similarities between, of course, what happened in Auschwitz and what Nazi Germany did, but at the same time, the global West, at least the Allies, they were ready with the Nuremberg trials and they were ready to hold people accountable. Yeah. When Palestine, when Gaza, we don't have these powers. We have little, apart from, of course, video documentary. The statistics aren't very easy to get, and we can't get numbers. So how are we going to hold the people accountable? When will it end? And what can we do about it?
Well, you see, the reason you're able to hold the Germans to account, at least to some degree, because the Germans lost the war. And the Germans, the Nazi criminals, I think Goering and others made a very valid point that if we had won the war, we could put you on trial. Because the Allies also committed war crimes. Not to the same degree and not in that, but that was the truth. So justice always belonged to the winner. So how are you going to have people to hold on to account? Well, today, the British and the French and the Canadian government sanctioned 2 Israeli ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. These people have made genocidal statements for years. But this time they went a little bit too far. Even their Western allies, sponsors, got sick of them. So they said, we're going to seize your goods and you can't travel here. Totally hypocrisy. Because those ministers are part of a government. Why don't they sanction the whole government? So, what can I tell you? Justice belongs to the victors. And as long as the West allies itself with this rabid... Let me read you something. This is an Israeli journalist, Gideon Levy. Just give me a second here, I'll find this quote for you. He said, Gideon Levy is one of the few people in Israel who tell the truth. In 1933, there was the Reichstag fire. The Reichstag, after the Nazis took over the parliament, the Reichstag was burnt down. and they accused this Bulgarian communist Dimitrov of having done it. And at that time, the courts were still a little bit independent, so Dimitrov defended himself. And somebody afterwards said that there was only one brave man in Germany, and he's a Bulgarian. Well, there's very few brave people in Israel. Gideon Levy is one of them. And he wrote recently, just last week, he says, the Israel Defense Forces for the past 20 months is an army of slaughter like the world has never seen. An army paving the way for genocide and population transfer. It destroys and takes pride, kills and boasts about it. Israeli opposition leader, a reserve general in the army, Yair Golan, said a few weeks ago that the Israeli forces are killing babies for a hobby. So the crimes are out in the world. Everybody can see it. Even Israelis are talking about it. But how are you going to hold them account? You're not. Except morally. And that makes a difference. So just because we can't bring them to trial physically doesn't mean we can't try them in the court of public opinion. And that's why your voices are so important. Because you and everybody else here can hold these people to account and can hold your politicians to account who are complicit or silent. That's how you're going to hold them to account. Thank you.
Free Palestine! Sorry. So I have another question.
Yeah.
Since we are talking about Germany, I'm Polish, but I live in Berlin since a few years.
Yeah.
And I'm experiencing something that I completely don't understand, which is the approach of Germans to the situation in Palestine these days.
They're the worst in the world.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
And also, I think most of people would explain them by the generational shame or guilt.
Yeah. No,
But
yeah.
I guess there must be more to it.
There's
It's
much
the
more.
third genocide that Germany is actively participating in.
Yeah.
And everyone who is trying to raise their voice against it is, of course, called anti-Semite. But also it's easy to get arrested only for saying Free Palestine or from the river to the sea. On demonstrations, there's ban for talking in other languages than German and English so that the police can understand everything well. And the more people try to resist, the answer of the government is more brutal, and I think that we are just running in circles. So I'm wondering if you think that there is any way that we can, as a collective, maybe try to wake up them to see the situation for what it is? How to do it? Because I think right now we have no solution. Thank you.
First of all, the Germans are the worst in the whole world, as you just said. If you're Jewish and protest against Israel in Germany, you're called an anti-Semite. The bloody Germans have the arrogance to tell a Jew that he's an anti-Semite if he supports Palestinians. Can you imagine that? I spoke in Berlin last year. The Germans never denazified. They put a few people on trial. They made a big show. And then they bought their way into the West by supporting Israel. So they talk about supporting Israel as a Staatsräson, as a state reason, because they never dealt with the Nazi ideology. The judges, the politicians, the teachers, These are all ex-Nazis. They never denazified. So they never dealt. They have this guilt and this shame, but they never asked us. They never asked the simple question: what is it about us that allowed us to do this? How do we have to change? Let me tell you something really interesting. So I was in Auschwitz today, and I saw the place of execution of Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant of Auschwitz. They hung him. He was brought back to Poland and put on trial and hung in the very place where he'd murdered all those people. A week before his execution, he wrote a letter to his son, and I'm quoting him, I'm paraphrasing him. He said, "Whatever you do, listen to your heart, not just your intellect. And don't believe what people tell you. Judge for yourself. Let your heart be the guide. Because I made the mistake of believing everything I was told. And I lost my humanity. And I did terrible things. And the reason I'm able to tell you this is because the Poles, when I was in jail, whom I had treated so terribly, were compassionate towards me. And that's the only time in my whole life that I've ever experienced compassion from anybody. So whatever you do, listen to your heart." He meant it. He meant it. Germany as a country never went through that process of what happened to us that we're able to do these terrible things. Therefore, they never learned anything. So when the state decides that for Staatsräson to join the Western Alliance and to become part of the civilized world again, we're going to support Israel, they just all go for it. Now, in terms of what you can do about it, I wish I could tell you, but here's the truth. I gave a talk, as part of this tour actually, they filmed me making a little statement about the Gaza flotilla, the Madeleine that was just pirated, abducted in international waters. Do you think the whole world cares? It's totally illegal. Anyway, I made this little statement in support of the fleet, and I said, "You're not going to get to Gaza, they're going to stop you, but you've already won a great victory for humanity." And that's been seen by over 5 million times in 2 days. But I can tell you, here's the sad truth of it. Personally, I've been speaking about this for a long time, and my talks have been seen by millions of people. Other people have spoken. Francesca Albanese, the wonderful Italian-born special rapporteur, international lawyer, she's spoken all over the place. Millions of people have seen her. Norman Finkelstein, an American scholar of Gaza, actually has written books for decades, not just since October the 7th, but for decades, about what Israel has been doing to Gaza. The Israeli historian, amongst other Israeli historians, Ilan Pappé, has exposed the lies about 1948, have done a research. We know the Nakba, the disaster, the massacres, the expulsions, the home destructions, the robbery of Palestinian lands. And all that writing and all that speaking and all the demonstrations and all the petitions have not saved a single finger of a single Palestinian child. That's the truth. So you might think, what's the point? Well, I can't tell you how to change the situation. I can only tell you one thing, that this can't go on. At some point it'll stop. At some point this whole project will stop. But it may take a long time. Don't fall into despair. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you're helpless and ineffective. That's what they want you to feel. Don't give them that victory. Because there's a much larger cause here. I mean, there's the specific cause of the Palestinians, and believe me, even though there was a debate today between Francesco Albanese and this British podcaster, Piers Morgan, and Albanese at some point said, "I don't want to talk to you anymore." She just hung up on the guy. It was a beautiful moment. And Piers Morgan was saying that this ship, the Madeleine, didn't help the Palestinians at all. Complete nonsense. It didn't succeed, and it was never going to succeed in getting that symbolic aid to Gaza. But I'm sure that it made a huge difference to the Gazans, that people care about them. I'm sure it makes a big difference to them that you're here listening to this conversation. They need the support. And even if you can't give the material support, and even if you can't force these governments, not that we should stop trying, to change their direction, even then it's essential that those people get the sense that they're being seen and heard, and that people care about them. That's the first point. So you can't lose here. The second point is, there was a Rabbi Tarfon who lived in the first century of our era, and he said that the task is not yours to, the task, he said, is not yours to finish. The task of healing the world is not yours to finish. He said, but neither are you free not to take part in it. So there's been a struggle going on in the world forever between freedom and dignity on the one hand, and oppression and power and hypocrisy on the other. And that struggle has been going on for thousands of years here in this country. Again, I don't have to tell you, it's been going on for a long time. And the task is not yours to finish, in a sense that you're probably, certainly I, will not live to see a world where liberty is the rule and freedom is the common value, and when truth governs. I'm not going to see that. You might not see it in your lifetime. The task is not yours to finish, but it's an eternal task, and you can contribute to it. And whatever little thing you can do, talking to a neighbor, sending a letter to a politician who doesn't want to see the truth, demanding that your media tells the truth, organizing, whatever you can do, you're adding to that long-term project. So I wish I could tell you how to change the situation in the short term. I can't. But don't let that make you feel or believe that whatever you do is valueless, because it isn't. You contributed to something very important, both for the present and for the future. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
So I wanted to ask if the situation at the occupied Palestine is created artificially created. Israel is created by the trauma of Jews from the Holocaust period, because Ashkenazi Jews that were living in that area during the mandate of Great Britain had regular relationships with Arab origins people. But then the movement that was created in Katowice in 1884 was supporting creation of the Israel country, and those were the people living to Palestine after the Second World War and started to fight with British people and Palestinians. After 24th of February, when the inflow of people from Ukraine to Poland started, people who were suffering from war, they didn't have support of psychologists. I was a supporter of, I was a psychologist, I was helping with that, and one of the faster reacting groups was people from Israel, with Russian speaking and English speaking people. I had a list of 40 people that were eager to help 24/7. Why those people are reacting differently to Russian activities and they are not reacting to genocide in Gaza? And the Palestinians from that part, the demolition or resettlements, is it the result of living in a country that taught you to hate Palestinians? What's the cause of it?
So, if I understand the question, is it that why is the world reacting differently to the Russian invasion of Ukraine than to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands? Yes? Well, you see, the West really cares about democracy and self-determination of peoples when it's in its interest. When it's not in its interest, it's willing to kill millions of people. So the democratic, free United States, which supports Ukraine, killed 3 million people in Vietnam. And based on a complete lie of weapons of mass destruction, it killed 500,000 civilians in Iraq. But you see, Russia is seen as an adversary. So when Russia invades Ukraine, and we could have an interesting debate about what happened and how that war started and all the complexities. But when Russia invades Ukraine, which it has no right to do, that's a big outrage, because anything that our enemies do is a big outrage. But when our friends do it, it's not happening. It's that simple, and it's that cynical. And there's one more thing. The Ukrainians are white. The Palestinians are brown. They're not in the same category. They're not in the same category. That's why. What a fun conversation we're having, aren't we? So jolly.
Hello. Another further question. Do you have an image, or do you imagine...
Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
Yes, sorry. How would you imagine a process of, I don't know if it's called integration, but of a psychological or sociological or even national or historical process that has to happen for people that come out of trauma of history and nationalism and genocide, and so they don't become victims that become another wave of oppressors then. So on a personal level, they don't become bullies, like we can know people from private life, or. But what I have in mind is the question about how would you imagine such a process for a nation, or at least an ethnic group?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because this weekend, I won't be there, but this weekend in Vienna, there's going to be a conference of Jews. It's the first World Congress of Anti-Zionist Jews. And I know there'll be some survivors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust there. So, just because you've been traumatized doesn't mean you have to become a traumatizer. It can go either way. This is true of nations as much as it is of individual human beings. But before anybody can heal, they have to realize that they're sick. And nations don't want to recognize that. Every nation wants to be a victim. The Hungarians are always the victims. I'm going there on Saturday. I'll be giving a talk. And I'm going to say to them, we need to get tired of being a victim. Because when you're a victim, then you're always afraid, and then the powerful leaders can always say, I'm here to protect you. That's happening here too. Some of it happened in your recent election, I think. So nations have the courage to question their own assumptions, and they have to break out of this victim role. But for that, they need leadership. And that leadership doesn't exist. So I'm afraid I don't have a very positive answer for you. It's a good question, but I don't have a good answer. Because before somebody can... I mean, look, I was a Zionist. But not only was I a Zionist, I was also an aggressor, even in my own home. When my kids were small, I used to have these rages. I didn't hit them. I did hit one of my sons once, when he was 3 years old. The worst moment of my life. But at some point I had to start asking myself, well, what's causing me to behave that way? And is this the way I want to be? And what's the source of it? And that's when I began to learn about myself, and that led to all my work that many of you know about. But I had to ask myself that question of, why am I like this? And is this who I really want to be? Until people ask themselves that question, there's nothing you can do to make them change. And nations don't like to question themselves. They want to believe in their own heroism, in their own victimhood, in their own rightness, and asking the question, well, who do you want to be? And what we have to learn about ourselves to be different. Most nations, or nations in general, don't ask themselves that question. And the Germans never asked themselves that. They just said, oh, we're guilty, we did a terrible thing. But they never said, why did we do it? And that's what people have to ask.
And in the educational system, do you have any
Educational system?
idea how that would be implemented?
Well, look, here's the thing. In my most recent book, The Myth of Normal, Mito Normalści or something in Polish, in the last chapter I talk about the educational system, the legal system, and the medical system. Now here's the deal. The average, even though there's all this information now, all this science, I mean, decades of research showing the relationship between trauma and physical illness and mental illness, the research is out there. The average doctor never hears a single lecture about trauma. Never hears a single lecture about trauma. Despite the fact that in every country that I know, probably here too, although I don't know the statistics, more and more children are being diagnosed with all kinds of attention problems and behavioral problems and mental health problems. The average teacher, which is all due to trauma, the average teacher never hears a single lecture about trauma. I guess. That's how it is in Canada. I'm sure that's the way it is in Poland. Despite the fact that in the legal system, all the people that go through there for addiction or violent crimes, all this, most of them have suffered significant trauma. The average lawyer, the average judge, never hears a single lecture about trauma. So when you ask about the educational system, what would have to happen is that teachers would have to be educated about trauma and human development. Same with doctors, same with lawyers, judges, and politicians. You know, so what you're talking about, or what you're touching upon, is the absolute lack of information that is informing or not informing all these important people. So they're working blindly. So yeah, what can I tell you? Yeah.
Good evening, my name is Nina. I will ask this question in Polish, if it's okay.
It's okay. I'll put on my earphones.
Ja chciałam z perspektywy osoby o pochodzeniu polsko-żydowskim,
From a perspective of a person of a Polish and Jewish origin, in born and raised in a tradition of conveying, like being a witness, for me this proof was the most important moment in my life. And I'm also from a family who has experienced Holocaust, and the fact that I can experience this testimony has helped me a lot. So thanks for that. Thanks for the lecture. And I wanted to ask a question. What is the testimony for you, and what did it mean for you? How can we add the Palestinian voices and the voices of other victims to our lives to be able to fight for the history and for the truth? For me, that it's possible. That is possible for me when sharing these experiences. I know it's hard, but this is a very strangely formulated question, because it's actually not a question, but I reformulate the question again. What is the testimony for you, and what can we do to hear more voices like this one? Thank you.
I almost understood the question. Did you understand it?
Yes. Nina asked what was the meaning of this testimony for both of you, of giving the testimony of a survivor of a genocide. And what should we do to hear more of those testimonies, because they have a healing power for her, in her own story, of course. But I guess also in general. So what did it mean for you to hear the testimony, or for Amjad to give the testimony?
Well, it's a shame. You're all here because I have a name and a reputation, and you respect that, and I appreciate that, and you care. But if this event was advertised as a Gazan scientist talking about his terrible personal experience how many people would be here? Would this theater be filled? Would it get the attention that my tour through Poland is getting? And why is what I have to say more valuable than the lived experience of this man? I'm glad that you're here. And I have to tell you, I'm feeling a bit heavy tonight. I'm not always this heavy, even when I talk about heavy subjects, but I was in Auschwitz today. So I'm very much under the effect of that. My throat is almost choking. But I'm asking you, and I'm not accusing you, I'm not blaming you, I'm just asking you to inquire into yourselves and into your culture. That why is it that most likely, if this man had declared that he will talk about his experience that's going on right now, there'd be very few people here. So for me, what it means is, I'm very glad that I had my chance to help my brother, John, express himself and to tell his story. I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful that he did. I'm grateful for you, that for your listening. So it means that. But it also means the terrible inequality of what and who we pay attention to. That's what it meant to me. Thanks for that question. What about you?
To be frank, I had this moral duty to speak about it, to speak about what happened to us, because it's very important for people to hear that the genocide is taking place. People are being killed every day without any warning. People are starving to death. People have no access to basic things. There's no water, there's no hygiene equipment. There's no basic food articles. I'm also very happy to be here with you to break the stereotype that Polish people are racist. I'm here in Wrocław and we feel very welcomed here. You are a huge support to us. People who are close to us, we can never feel that we don't belong. You are so warm to us, so nice. Your presence, as the doctor said, maybe it's not the fact that you can hear what is in my heart, what must be said, so that people can know and learn that this is something that we should be aware of, that something should be done to improve the situation of those people. Thank you very much.
So I think we can take one more question and then we'll have to put an end. It's not up to me, it's whoever's got the mic.
Hi, hello. So I
whereabouts are you?
Up here, left, up.
To the left.
Hello, to the left. Hello.
To my right?
Yes, to your left.
Oh,
no.
okay.
Yes.
To my right. Okay.
Hello. No. To your left.
To my left. Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I see you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Agata. Thank you for being here. I will jump straight to the question. So you said that the people will be held people responsible for the genocide will be held accountable in the court of public opinion, which was beautiful. But I was wondering, what do you think, moral accountability or this kind of accountability in the court of law would touch or affect these kinds of ruthless people more? Is it as simple as shifting attention to the survivor, or how to find peace in that when the perpetrator cannot be held accountable for what they do?
Well, one of the greatest war criminals of the 20th century was Henry Kissinger, who contributed to the deaths of millions of people in Asia. And he died in bed at age 100, full of the praise and respect of the American establishment. We don't always see justice served the way we would like to. If Netanyahu was some Serbian general who had killed Muslims in Bosnia, he would be at The Hague at the International Court. If he was a petty African dictator who had tortured and massacred some of his own people or people of some neighboring country, he'd be at the International Criminal Court. When the International Criminal Court charged Netanyahu and several other Israeli ministers with war crimes, you know what the Americans just did? They sanctioned the members of the International Court. They punished them for having the temerity, the arrogance to charge one of America's allies with war crimes. I wish I was a religious person. I wished I believed in hell, because then I could be pretty sure that these people will meet their punishment. I'm afraid I don't. I don't have that satisfaction. I believe in the human heart. I do. And in the hearts of those humans that are open, whose eyes are open, justice is already being done. And we may have to be satisfied with that. But it's not nothing. It's not nothing. So in terms of what we can do, again, I can only repeat. I can't tell you what to do. I can only know, given my capacities and energies and availabilities and possibilities, what can I do? But you have to ask yourself the same question. Given your position, given your situation, given your commitment, what can you do to bring more light and more truth to this terrible, terrible situation? That's the only question that you can ask yourself right now. And only each one of you can answer that for yourself. Well, I hope to come back someday and talk about happy things like addiction and trauma and so on. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm I am more willing to risk imprisonment or any other negative outcome personally than I am willing to risk the curtailment of my intellectual freedom and that of those around me whom I care for equally as I do for myself. And again, that's not to say that I'm self-sacrificing, because it gives me, I feel good in my human experience to know that I can contribute to the good of others.